Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving straight into what is literally one of the most stark, dramatic underdog stories in Islamic history, at least according to our source material. We're unpacking the Battle of Badr, or Ghazwa-e Badr. And look, this isn't just your standard historical clash. The source actually presents it as this monumental turning point where totally impossible odds met overwhelming conviction. So if you're the kind of person who loves a story where every single variable is stacked against the protagonist, you are going to find this absolutely fascinating.
I mean, just look at the sheer disparity here. It's undeniable. We've got a tiny band of roughly 313 men going up against a massive, fully armored force of 1,000 warriors. And get this, according to the source, the Muslims had a grand total of 8 swords and 2 horses among the entire group. 8 swords. That means guys were literally lining up for battle holding wooden sticks. On the flip side, you have this massive force bristling with weapons, backed by hundreds of horses and full logistical support. We are plunging straight into David versus Goliath stakes here. So how on earth did a group with 8 swords plan to take on a fully equipped army? Well, to understand that, we have to look at how they even got here in the first place.
Let's get right into Section 1, the setup and historical context.
Because, this confrontation didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was the absolute boiling point of tensions that have been escalating for over a decade. We're looking at 13 years of severe persecution in Mecca, which was then followed by the migration to Medina, where they had to leave almost everything behind. But the source really emphasizes what happened next. The Meccan leadership actually confiscated the properties and the wealth that the Muslims had left behind, essentially rendering them entirely destitute. So by year 15, the Muslims in Medina weren't trying to start some massive unprovoked war. They were simply looking for a way to recover their stolen livelihoods.
So going into this, their initial objective was actually purely compensatory. They marched out to intercept a lightly guarded trade caravan led by Abu Sufyan. And this caravan was carrying immense wealth that was generated directly from their confiscated properties. It was supposed to be a straightforward interception to just reclaim their economic lifeline, which, when you think about it, is exactly why they only brought 8 swords. They weren't dressed for a full-scale war, they were dressed for an errand.
Which brings us to Section 2, a sudden shift in plans.
Because, let's be real, history rarely goes according to plan. Put yourself in their shoes for just a second. Imagine that sudden panic, that sheer drop in your stomach. You walk out expecting a lightly guarded trade caravan, and suddenly the whole situation flips. The easy mission completely evaporates, and you realize you've accidentally walked right into a deadly trap against an overwhelming military force. And here is exactly how that trap materialized. Abu Sufyan, realizing the Muslims were on their way, diverted his highly valuable caravan away from the main road and took a longer, much safer coastal route. But at the exact same time, he dispatched a fast rider to Mecca to sound the alarm. And the Meccan leadership, spearheaded by Abu Jahl, well, they saw this as the perfect excuse. They didn't just send a few extra guards. They marched out with a heavily armed force of 1,000 elite warriors, fully intending to crush the Muslims once and for all. So the caravan was completely safe, but that massive Meccan army, they kept marching toward Badr anyway.
Now, to explain this sudden, terrifying shift in plans, the source introduces a deeply theological perspective. They refer to this event as Yom ul Furqan, which translates to the Day of Criterion. According to the speaker, this clash wasn't just some historical accident, it was a divine setup. The whole idea is that a victory over an unarmed caravan wouldn't really prove anything to anyone. But if 313 poorly equipped men managed to defeat an army of 1,000, that would be seen as an undeniable miracle. It would be a definitive physical separation between truth and falsehood.
So, facing literal imminent annihilation, the Prophet consulted his companions, and the response he got brilliantly illustrates the intense, unwavering human resolve of this heavily outmatched force. One of the companions, Miqdad, referenced the story of Moses, where Moses' followers basically refused to fight. But Miqdad fiercely stated that they would absolutely not abandon their leader. He said, "We will fight in front of you, behind you, to your right, and to your left." They pledged to fight on all sides, completely willing to sacrifice themselves against that 1,000-man army.
Moving right along to Section 3, the climax, prayers and interventions. This brings us to the absolute climax of the battle. Before the swords even clashed, the emotional weight of this moment reached its absolute peak. The sources details just how desperate and intense the Prophet's plea was. "O Allah, if this small band perishes today, you will not be worshipped on earth." He had spent 15 years building this small community, and now his entire life's work and all of his followers' lives were teetering on the brink of being entirely wiped out. The speaker really emphasizes that the Prophet understood the devastating stakes here. If this 313-man band fell, the entire movement was going to die right there with them in the desert sand.
So, the million-dollar question:
how does a group with just 8 swords actually survive? Well, the source meticulously maps out 3 miraculous elements that completely shifted both the tactical and psychological advantage. Step 1, a sudden drowsiness overcame the terrified Muslim camp. Instead of panicking all night long, they slept deeply, waking up with total psychological peace. Step 2, a heavy rain fell. Now for the Meccans, this just created a bunch of mud. But for the Muslims, it settled the loose sand, making it way easier to walk on, and it gave them much-needed drinking water. And step 3, the theological texts report that God actually sent down thousands of angels to strengthen the hearts of the believers and to strike fear into the enemy.
And there's this really fascinating detail the speaker highlights here, connecting human action directly with divine help. During the battle, the prophet actually picked up a handful of pebbles and threw them toward the Meccan army. The source explains that while a human can obviously only throw pebbles a few feet, divine intervention carried this dust directly into the eyes of the enemy lines, blinding and confusing them. It's presented as this powerful, symbolic gesture, right? Human effort was required to initiate the act, but divine will is what actually completed it.
Let's look at the aftermath. In Section 4, the ultimate criterion and legacy.
When the dust finally settled, the power dynamics in Arabia had violently and permanently shifted. 70. That is the number of elite Meccan leaders killed in the battle, and that included their chief commander, Abu Jahl. Another 70 were taken prisoner. The source makes a point to mention that the Quraysh tribe of Mecca had this absolute aura of invincibility. They were the respected keepers of the Kaaba, no one dared challenge them. But by losing their top 70 leaders to a small band of displaced refugees, that invincibility was completely, totally shattered.
The reversal of fortunes here was absolute. I mean, just look at the contrast. Pre-Badr, the Muslims were a persecuted, destitute minority. They were incredibly vulnerable. But post-Badr, they emerged as an established political and military power in Arabia. Their confiscated wealth was reclaimed, their morale absolutely skyrocketed, and surrounding tribes suddenly respected them. The Day of Criterion had done exactly what the source claimed it was meant to do. It firmly established their legitimacy on the map.
But, as we near the end of this explainer, the source speaker pivots to a really fascinating modern challenge. He asks the audience, if you believe in historical divine intervention, like angels and miracles at Badr, does that erase the need for physical effort and strategy today? The speaker is highly critical of people who just sit around in shrines or in their rooms praying for miracles to magically solve their modern problems without actually doing any of the hard work themselves.
And this brings us to our final takeaway. The speaker's core argument is that relying purely on faith without putting in the physical work is a total misunderstanding of history. Just look at Badr. Even with the promise of divine help, the prophet and his companions still had to physically march out into the desert, plan their strategy, face unimaginable terror, and risk their very lives. The miracles didn't erase the suffering or the need for action. They merely supported it. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. If the ultimate underdog victory required absolute human sacrifice before a miracle could happen, what does it say about how we approach our own insurmountable challenges today? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.